Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Your Excellency, the Governor of Saudi Standards Metrology and Quality Organization, Dr. Saad Al-Qasabi, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's our great pleasure to welcome you at the headquarters of SASO, and we are glad to have you joining us in this seminar entitled The Role of Standards in Enabling the Economic Growth of the Private Sector. We cordially extend our warm welcome to Mr. Sergio Mujica, Secretary General of the ISO, who is here to share his knowledge and experience on the role of standards in fostering economic growth for the private sector. Dear audience, the ISO is an international body with 169 national standardization bodies around the world working on developing unified standards to ensure the quality of goods and services, to fulfill the global needs and goals, as well as sustainability. And now, we leave the floor to Mr. Sergio Mujica, Secretary General of the ISO.
Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, colleagues and friends, good afternoon to all of you. Let me start by thanking the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and our colleagues and friends from SASO for inviting me to participate in this activity. It's really a pleasure for me to visit your beautiful country and to enjoy your warm hospitality. You really made me feel at home here, so thank you so much. And also to allow me to talk about my favorite topic, ISO, and how we can contribute to economic and social development. So my presentation is divided in three main parts. First, I want to share with you some information about the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. After that, I'll say a few words about how standards can be an instrument for competitiveness. And I understand the majority of the audience comes from the private sector and business, so I hope we have a good conversation there. And then a very important topic is about how can you participate in the standard development process? How can you let your voice be heard? So let's start with ISO. And everything began in 1946, right after World War II, because at that time it was already understood that if we wanted to rebuild the world, we needed international standards. ISO was created as part of the cluster of international organizations that were created after World War II, such as the United Nations, the GATT, which became the WTO afterwards, and many others. And the conviction, the deep conviction of our founders, at that time only 25 countries, was that international standards can contribute to economic and social development, can be instrumental to protect people, and also to protect the planet. So this is ISO 75 years later. It's not longer 25 members. Now we have 169. You can see all kind of colors, all kind of cultures, developing countries, developed countries. Is a truly global organization. And this is a picture that was taken a month ago during our General Assembly in Brisbane, Australia. Can you recognize the SASO governor here? Let me help you. There he is. Dr. Saad Al-Kasabi represented SASO at the ISO annual meeting and our General Assembly. And not only that, let me share with you that 169 countries elected him as a member of the board, as the member of the Council of the ISO, which is a very important responsibility and also an honor, because the Council drives the strategy of the organization and the implementation of our strategy. So it's a big accomplishment, so welcome back to the Board of Directors of ISO. Very well. So when we talk about ISO, one mistake that people normally make is that they think that ISO is our building in Geneva. And it's really not like that. ISO is so much more than that. It's a system, a network, or a family, as I like to call it. And it is composed of three main pillars. Pillar number one is the member. As I said before, not longer 25, now 169, representing over 99% of the global GDP. And we truly believe that we are a member-driven organization. So we have created the rules for the ISO member to make the most important decisions for us, both in the governance side as well as in the technical side. And please remember, when you talk about ISO, don't think about Geneva. Think about your own country, because ISO is here as we speak, and it's represented by SASO and by Dr. Saad Al-Kasabi and the wonderful staff I had the pleasure to meet with today. So we are not going anywhere when I leave this country on Wednesday. ISO will remain because it's part of the ISO system. Second, the second pillar is our technical activities, because the ISO standards are not written in my office in Geneva. Once again, it could be perhaps very easy for me to hire 2-3 consultants, and in 2-3 weeks' time, I can give you a new international standard. But it doesn't work like that. We follow a process that respect very fundamental principles that have been established by the World Trade Organization. We create standards, taking decisions by consensus. And this is not easy, but it's so important. Working in a very inclusive manner, everybody's invited to sit on the table, even if they disagree with what we're discussing, with a high level of transparency, and very importantly, giving a voice to everyone, and in particular to developing countries. An essential element of our value proposition is that we cannot create standards by and for a small group of rich countries or in one region of the world. You really need to make a value proposition that makes sense to the global community. And what we have today is an incredible network of 52,000 international experts appointed by you, by the members of ISO, having a conversation about what is the best way of. This is how I like to describe it, the conversations by our experts in the technical committees. What is the best way of creating a product, conducting a service, or a process? And we have around 800 technical committees that create the standards every day as we speak. And the portfolio is 24,000 international standards, which are already at your disposal. And finally, the third element of this network, of the ISO system, now you have the building in Geneva. The ISO Central Secretariat or headquarters are located there, which is your international home. So I hope that every time you go to Geneva, you can visit us to see how the engine room works for this organization. So that's ISO. Now let me talk about what kind of role international standards can play to ensure competitiveness of the industry and also of the countries. And to talk about that, we need to understand what is the context in which we operate, which has changed so much compared to the context we had in 1946 or 1947. Now, there are very important challenges that we are facing today as a humankind, as the world. First of all, starting with a very challenging economic situation, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, just released the latest economic outlook report, predicting a decrease in the global growth for next year of 0.5 from 3%, from 3.5 to 3%. But what is interesting there is the underlying factors for that decrease. So we're talking about a very complex geopolitical situation that we are all very, very aware of. We're talking about a very persistent inflation, which challenges everyone. And we're talking about a very high level of polarization in the world. And that is very complex for an organization like ISO, where our business is collaboration and consensus. But this is the context we are operating in. The second one is about artificial intelligence that has many opportunities for all of us, but it also has some existential risks for many of you, many of the businesses, or international organizations, or governments. So the key challenge there is how do we leverage on those new opportunities, but at the same time mitigate and are prepared to face the risks that are coming. The G7 in March this year, during the summit, the leader of those 7 countries highlighted in their conclusions the need for solid international standards to regulate AI. And the third element that I wanted to highlight with you is the so-called triple planetary crisis, because we tend to focus on climate change only, but it's a lot more complex than that. It's climate change, biodiversity, and also pollution. So when it comes to climate change, the main research institution is the called Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they have issued their latest report saying that we are in a very complex situation and definitely off track to meet our commitments on climate change. They have titled that report The Warning, which means that some of the consequences of climate change are not a threat for the future. They are a reality happening today as we speak. And many of those consequences are already irreversible, such as the rise in the sea level. There are people dying. And last year in Europe, 61,000 people died because of the heat wave, a majority of them women, actually. And we have 42 million people displaced every year because of climate change. So it is happening as we speak. The good news is that there are still many things that we can do to face those challenges, but it's a very dramatic situation. The second element, as I mentioned, is pollution. What to say about plastics, for example, but air pollution alone is responsible for 4.2 million people dying every year, air pollution. And then biodiversity, where we have the report of the WWF saying that in the last 50 years we have lost 69% of the global biodiversity. So this is the context we are operating in, and we believe that the ISO standards are essential to respond to these global challenges and to support the recovery of the global economy. So what is it what we offer, and why ISO standards? Let's start with a definition of what an international standard is. An international standard is a set of requirements or a specification that ensure that a product, a service, or a process is fit for purpose. So it involves a promise that if you follow certain rules, your product will be useful as promised. It will be fit for purpose. So it's a very profound promise or commitment that we all make to the world and also to our customers. And what makes the ISO standards so important is that they are developed by a global community of experts and stakeholders. So it's government, private sector, academia, everybody is included, and it's a truly global conversation. The second key element is that it responds to market needs. I don't tell you what you need. It's the other way around. It's the industry that approach the standard body and say, we need a new standard on whatever. And then that standard body make a proposal to the international community, and we create a new standard. We don't want to have solutions looking for problems. We need to understand what the issues are and respond to those issues. And nobody's better placed than the industry, that you have the feet on the ground to understand what you need, and we will respond as a standard community. And the third key element of ISO is that it's applied across the globe. These are not solutions that can be applied only in one small portion of the globe. They really need to comply with what we call the principle of global relevance. Let me give you some examples about how we can all benefit from international standards, and not only ISO standards, as well as the IEC standards or ITU or other global players in this area. First of all, standard can be very important, a key instrument for policymakers and for regulators, because they can be utilized in regulations. So, and you are private sector. We all understand that the worst thing that can happen is to have regulators reinventing the wheel. So it couldn't be better if they use a standard that already exists and incorporate it or make a reference of those standards in the regulation. This is very cost effective, and it also has a high degree of acceptance because that standard was created in an open manner, allowing for participation from those that we will suffer, if you wish, the application of that regulation. And then another very important element is every time that a government comes up with a new technical regulation, that technical regulation should be based on international standards. Otherwise, it could be considered a technical barrier to trade. And this has been established by the World Trade Organization. We don't want technical regulations used to protect the local industry or the local market. We want a local market that is competitive all around the world, and for that needs to follow very clear rules. So that's a clear benefit of standards when they are used for policymakers and regulators. The second key area that I wanted to highlight with you is the role of standards to boost economic growth. And this is particularly important after what I mentioned in the global economic situation. We have evidence that through standards, we can increase the GDP of the various countries. We have, for example, the United Kingdom, that a few years ago conducted a study by an independent university about the power of standards to support economic growth, and came up with the conclusion that in the UK, 27% of the GDP growth is explained by the use of standards, 27%. The same methodology was followed a few years later by the Nordic countries, so Norway, Iceland, you name it. And then last year, through an ISO project to support developing countries, we used exactly the same methodology to analyze the impact of standards in the GDP growth in 6 developing countries. And we arrived to very similar conclusions. So at the end, what I want to say is that it's been proven that by using international standards, we can boost the economic growth of the countries. The same thing happens with export, which is very important as a tool for economic growth, because it's through a standard that we can, all countries, use the same universal language to understand what we need to achieve in terms of technical specifications and technical requirements. And we use a standard that will be understood and will be recognized by other countries. That is why it opens doors for new exports. The third key element I wanted to highlight is the role of standards to support you as private sector, so you can have a better performance in your economic activities. So it has also been demonstrated that through the use of standards, and in particular through the use of management standards, you can reduce your costs, and you can have a clear competitive advantage to the other companies in the same sector as you are. There is a very important reputational element, and also the fact that through the use of international standards, you will apply international best practice in your company. And it's also been proven that you can increase the customer satisfaction. And there is a very important element that connects actually the success of the organizations with the government regulations, because through management standards, you can have a better performance in terms of compliance of government regulations. And finally, the element of trust, which is so important. Through conformity assessment activities, including verification and certification, we can ensure that the promise involved behind standards, as I mentioned before, a promise that whatever I put to the market is fit for purpose. Through conformity assessment, I can increase the level of certainty, and also I can increase the level of trust. And trust is so important here. One of the global trends that we are observing now is an unprecedented crisis of trust in the world. There is a report that is issued every year. It's called the Edelman Report, with a survey to over 32,000 people from all around the world. And it has been established that people don't trust worldwide. I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia. People don't trust institutions. They don't trust their government. They don't trust international organizations. They don't even trust their neighbors. There is an impressive statistics saying that only 25% of people would help their neighbor if they are thinking in a different manner. So which is a very disruptive global trend. So it's through a standard, it's through conformity assessment that we can increase the level of trust in the whole system. And I know, and I included this slide because I know that SMEs has been included in your national strategy, Saudi Arabia National Strategy for Economic and Social Development. And we have also conducted studies about the role of standards in SMEs. And many times it is said that standards can be an obstacle for SMEs. And it can be said that standards are only for large, big corporations, but for SMEs it's very complex. And there is a degree of truth on that. Sometimes it's not easy to incorporate in your organization best practice. It's true. But at the end, it's a very powerful investment that will improve your performance in the medium and long term. We can incorporate, it's an element for transfer knowledge, saying that you have the best minds of the world assessing what is the best practice. You have that at your disposal to apply it into your SME. It's very important. You can also rationalize your cost and management and access to new markets. And finally, the element of consumers, because consumers is what we vote for. And we wouldn't be successful if our consumers are not satisfied with our products. So it's through standards and conformity assessment that they can have certainty and confidence about the quality and performance of our products. But there is another very important element, because the behavior of the consumers have changed significantly in the last few years. In the past, you would see consumers looking for something which is cheap. It's not very expensive. Then the consumer gave one step up and said, it's price, yes, but also quality. I need to make sure that there is a right level of quality. But now, consumers want to make sure that they are being part of the solution when it comes to certain global challenges, such as climate change, for example. We have very conscious consumers that want to ensure that when they consume a product, they are not helping global warming. So that is our responsibility as well, to ensure those consumers that we follow best practice in terms of sustainability and in terms of climate change. And this brings me to the last part of my presentation, which is about your role in the standard development process. Because we are all very proud to use international standards, and that is definitely a competitive advantage, that's for sure. And international standards will affect all of us, whether we like it or not. They will affect us in our businesses. But we have the unique opportunity to not only be a standard taker, which is already good, but also to be a standard maker, to influence and to shape the standards that will be affecting me in the future. So you can shape that future. You can anticipate the trends. You can stay ahead of the pack, move first. If you participate in standard making, in technical committees, you also have the opportunity to access this wonderful network of experts, both at the national level and also at the international level. And you can increase your brand reputation. We have seen that in many organizations, in many companies, that they are not only selling the fact that they use ISO standard, but also the fact that they participate in the creation and update of standards. So how can you do it? Well, here is your best friend sitting right there, Dr. Saad Al-Kasabi. Through the national standard body, in this case, SASO, you can join the national mirror committees, and let me explain how it works. For each technical committees that you participate as a country, you have the obligation to have a national mirror committee where you bring all the stakeholders from that country, you have conversations, you achieve a position by consensus, and then you bring that position to the international level. That is why we say that at ISO, we work at a double layer of consensus. First, consensus at the national level at the mirror committee, and then consensus at the international level by all the global players. It's through SASO that you can also propose new work items. So as I said before, we don't want solutions looking for problems. You know what kind of challenges you face every year, every day, and you can use international standards to meet those challenges. So through SASO, you can propose new work items and trigger international standardization. And you can also participate at the international level in the international committee by making inputs and comments to the drafts that we prepare. Thank you very much.
Please have a seat, Mr. Sergio. Thank you very much, Mr. Sergio, for the valuable presentation. And now we will invite His Excellency Dr. Saad to join us on the stage to share with us his comments and to start the Q&A session.
Thank you, Sergio, for this very informative session. Thank you, our audience, for coming and participating in this gathering. I'll open the floor now for questions. And first, we'll receive 3 questions, and then we will leave the floor for Sergio to answer your questions and concerns. So if there's any questions from the audience, please feel free to raise a question. Mr. Sami.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sami Sagar. I'm the Vice President for Operations Sector in the Saudi Food and Drug Authority. I would believe that, thank you for the nice and informative presentation. I think the most challenging part in the standards is the enforcement of these standards and the compliance. And since I am the responsible guy in the CFDA for all inspection activities, that we might find it a little bit difficult to do the market surveillance. It's costly, requiring a lot of budgets, human resources. I would ask if the ISO organization working on developing new standards for the market surveillance, utilizing the new technologies such as the blockchain, Internet of Things, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sami. Any other question? Audience? Okay, maybe we can start. Okay, here.
Hello.
Mr. Thomas.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. This is Thomas Al-Hamadi, Vice Governor Advisor for Standards and Calibration. Again, we would like to welcome you in Saudi and in Riyadh especially, and in Sasso. And thank you for this distinguished speech today. I guess you mentioned something related. The standards are based on the technical regulations. If it's not, it will be concerned as a TBT. Is that what you, I think, drop it in one of your slides? So the question here, how, in a lot of countries, there are no technical regulations. So how can they, or what is the mechanism for implementing the standards and following and review it and, of course, develop it again? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas, another question here.
Yes. Hello. This is Ahmed from Standard Department. I have a question, and I would like to get your answer and your advice. We have already proposed a new standard item, and our proposal got more than 2/3 positive votes, but the proposal was refused because there is no enough experts who are available to work on the project. So ISO requested 5 experts, and we got 4. So my question is, do we have the right to ask for naming experts again? Do we have another chance, or it's just finished? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Sergio, if you please answer the questions.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you for those very good and sharp questions. So to the first question, I think it's very important to underline that standards are an invitation for excellence. So it's only one portion of the ISO standards that are used in regulations, and they are made mandatory. So a large majority of the ISO standards are voluntary by nature, because as I said before, it's an invitation for excellence, and it's a differentiator. It's a market differentiator. So you can sell yourself and the reputation of your organization as one that implements global best practice, as one that goes beyond regulations. Normally, regulations reflects a minimum acceptable by the society. So you say, at the minimum, you should do X. Standards don't tell you the minimum. They tell you the best you can achieve. And that's why, in a large majority of the cases, standards are voluntary. Okay. Then, some of the ISO standards are used by policymakers and regulators to be referenced in their regulations or legislation. And that is a good thing, as I mentioned before, because it saves time, it's cost effective, and it has a great level of acceptance. So it's a very good thing. But when it comes to market surveillance, I know that this can be very challenging for the governments. It requires a lot of awareness raising and education, because believe me, there is no enforcement that can replace the good behavior of the citizens. So they need to understand that a regulation is for the good of the society at large. But of course, not everybody is, very well behaved. So it needs to be accompanied by a level of credible enforcement. On that, we don't have an ISO standard on best practice on market surveillance that I'm aware of. It's a very interesting idea. It's something that we could perhaps push to see whether there is global appetite to tackle that very important dimension. Because what is very important for the private sector is to operate in a level playing field. So they cannot feel that they're making all the effort to do the right thing, and then the neighbor is doing nothing and nothing happens. So that we cannot allow, not only for the sake of the society protection, but also for the sake of equality. The second question was about standards in technical regulations. What the WTO says through the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade is that when governments create technical regulations, they should apply international standards as the basis for that technical regulations. What we see, unfortunately, is that many times governments are very creative in doing those technical regulations, because what they're doing at the end is to create artificial obstacles to protect the national industry. So the way that you can guarantee to the world that your technical regulation is fit for purpose is through basing that regulation in international standards. And that is why it's so powerful that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, recognizes ISO. In particular, they don't mention many organizations, but they do mention ISO as one of the standards that can be used in technical regulations. The third question, I'm sorry, that's my first statement. I'm sorry that your new work item proposal didn't pass the threshold of 5 experts. There is a reason for that. It's not an arbitrary threshold. As I mentioned in my presentation, a key principle in the ISO standards is the principle of global relevance. So a new standard cannot be created with a very few people. So we need to ensure that it's made by and for the global community. So it is possible that something that is very needed in a particular context is not mature enough to be created as an international standard. To your question, the answer is yes, it can be proposed again, because what we want is more good, relevant international standards. So if we manage to improve the conditions and to make sure that we'll achieve the threshold of global relevance, we would be very happy to tackle that issue.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, here, Dr. Mohammed.
Hello, I'd like to welcome you again. There is no doubt of the empirical and scientific evidence that links quality to the GDP at the national level. The question and the challenge and seeking your advice in that is how to translate that importance to the market, to the SMEs, to the small and medium businesses, and to the other smaller national bodies.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Any other question? هنا بالوسط.
Well, thank you for the contribution to the international standard. Is there a mechanism to stop the abuse or overuse of ISO logos as a way of achieving excellence with organization that does not actually carry the practice? They just know they have the standard, but they don't execute the best practice in that domain.
Thank you. Any other question? هنا الأخير.
Thank you for presentation, but there is one question. It's related to ISO also or standard for about HS code. HS code is coming from many abroad. Sometimes it's coming from many origin, and also different HS code. In one invoice, it is cost, but we don't know